Let's read Matthew 5, verse 43. Jesus says, he continues, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, I don't like that. What about you? I can't do that. I don't even want to do that. Imagine that. Love the police officer who arrested you. Love the person who abused you. Love the colleague who slandered you. Love the bully who battered you. Love the spouse who cheated on you. Love the social worker who removed your kids. Love the friend who has threatened you. Love the dad who disowned you. In some parts of the world, love the terrorist who is persecuting and killing you for being a Christian. You having that? Because I read that from Jesus and I don't like it. I can't do that. Some of you have seen in the press this week the incident where Scott Brown, the Celtic player, walks out and a Rangers fan says, "How's your sister?" If you don't know, Scott Brown's sister died in 2008, aged 21, from skin cancer. Now, the player's been banned from Ibrox for life. Yesterday, if not the player, the fan, banned from Ibrox for life, and a journalist in the Times yesterday wrote an article saying, this fan should not be banned for life, he should be forgiven, and Scott Brown should reach out to him. And again, I'm going, no, actually. I don't like that. I can't do that. I cannot love my enemies. In fact, where I very easily and naturally sit is in three other places that Jesus is going to show us this morning. We're going to look at loving like a Pharisee, loving like a tax collector, and then loving like a pagan. And I want to show you, actually, that is where I comfortably sit. Look again at verse 43. Loving like a Pharisee. "You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Now, Jesus is pulling here on the teaching of the Pharisees. And I look at that and I go, actually, yeah, that's better. Love your neighbours, generally, but hate your enemies. Now, we need to understand what's going on. The Pharisees, if you've not heard of them before, are teachers of God's law. And here they're kind of selecting and summarizing parts of God's word. But they are being very selective for a very deliberate reason. They want to make keeping God's law easier. So here's what they do. They select and summarize. So, they select a part of God's law. Leviticus says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Now, which bit do they leave out? As yourself. Why? What are they doing? They are making it easier to obey. So, yes, love your neighbor, but let's limit how much you have to love them. Not as much as you love yourself. Love your neighbor, but not that much. They then add this bit on, hate your enemy. Now, what they're probably doing here, because that's said nowhere in the Old Testament, they're probably trying to summarize a lot of what they understand by some of the commands of God and some of the Psalms of God that say things like, "Go into the land and destroy all of your enemies," or songs that rejoice in God judging his enemies. And what they do is, they're summarizing this into hate your enemies so that God's end-time judgment can be used to justify their present-day hatred. You see what they're doing? Selecting and summarizing, and so they end up with, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Now, the fact that I prefer that to what Jesus says is interesting. These guys, the Pharisees, have a bad rep amongst Christians as these kind of religious do-gooders who are a bit up themselves and a bit down on everyone else. But actually what we need to see is there is something attractive about them. Because what they do is, although they add rules, they're actually trying to make it easier for you to fulfill them. Easier because they make everything external rather than internal. Okay, well, that's an internal amount. They've said things like, the commandment, "Do not murder," doesn't have anything to do with the attitude in your heart or any sweary words that come out of your mouth. It just has to do with whether you actually take the life of someone who hasn't deserved it. To make it easier. Or the command, do not commit adultery, doesn't have anything to do with lust in your heart, at just looking at someone of the opposite sex or the same sex. It just has to do with whether you actually sleep with someone who is all ready to marry to someone else. You see? Easier because they keep it external. But they also making it easier not just by making it external, but by keeping it very earthly. It's just about like man-made traditions rather than heaven-sent commands. So, in the command to keep oaths, they make it all about, okay, as long as you don't invoke God's name and you're careful and savvy about what you swear on, then actually God doesn't really care if you break your oath. Keep it earthy. Or in the commands to divorce. Divorce has nothing to do with the Heavenly Father making two people one, and so actually you can just divorce your missus by giving a certificate. So they keep it earthy. They're trying to make it easier for people to obey, including themselves. And actually it's the easiness of what they're teaching that appeals to me. See, back in the day, the Pharisees are not pantomime kind of bullies and villains that when they walk in everyone boos. Actually, they were the ones whose churches were full and people loved to listen to. Because it made obedience easier. Do you know, if we wanted to grow Grace Mount Community Church, it would be a dead easy way to do it. Lessen on the commands of God, particularly on things like marriage and adultery and all those kind of things, and make it more culturally acceptable and easier to become a member. And we'd grow our church. Easy commands like, yeah, sure, love your neighbour, but you can legit hate your enemy. Now I sit there much more comfortably than what Jesus is going to say. Now he goes on to show a second group. He moves from Pharisees to tax collectors. So, love like a Pharisee, love your neighbour, hate your enemy. Second, love like a tax collector. Now, going from one group to the other is like going from the top of the food chain to the bottom. Pharisees, the religious teachers of the law. Tax collectors, scum of the earth. And Pharisees despise tax collectors. Jesus will tell a story of a time where a Pharisee walked into the temple, sees a tax collector at the back, walks all the way to the front, and says to God, God, thank you that I am not like him. It's a relationship between the two. Now the guy who's recording these words of Jesus is called Matthew. Matthew was what? A tax collector. Now when Jesus calls Matthew from his tax collector's booth, Jesus then goes with Matthew back to Matthew's house, and he has dinner with Matthew and a bunch of his friends, who were also tax collectors. And the Pharisees look at Jesus sitting with the scum of the earth, and they come to Jesus' disciples, and he says, why does your teacher eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Despise them. And so Matthew's here as a tax collector, knowing that relationship, but also knowing exactly what tax collectors are like. And so he records the words of Jesus here, in a way saying, yeah, he nails us. This is what we're like. Look at verse 46. You love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? How do you love like a tax collector? You love those who love you. Now again, I like that. That's easy, that's comfortable. Particularly if you're a tax collector. If you're a tax collector and no one else likes you, no one else will sit and eat dinner with you, then who are the only people who are likely to come to your table? Other tax collectors. Why? Because it is easy to love those who are like you and love those who love you. I guess if you want to put it bluntly, in our community, thinking of tax collectors bottom of the barrel, who do junkies hang out with? Largely other junkies. Now we're going to come and see how that applies to all of us. But there is that sense in which we tend to love those who are like us and love those who love us. People who won't challenge us, who do the same things we do, who turn a blind eye to the things we turn a blind eye to. Now what you need to see of what Jesus is doing here is massively, massively shocking to a Pharisee. He's saying to the Pharisee, you say, love your neighbour, hate your enemies. The tax collectors at the bottom are saying, love those who love you. Which is what? It's basically the same thing. Isn't it? It's just another way of saying exactly the same thing. And so what is the punch in the gut if you're a Pharisee? The way you love is no better than the way a tax collector loves. You walk into church and you pray, thank you that I am not like this tax collector. And Jesus says, you are exactly like this tax collector. You love your neighbours, hate your enemies. You love those who love you. Your love is exactly the same. Oh, self-righteous Pharisee, you're no better than him. See his point? Now he goes on to say the same thing a third time. Look at verse 47. And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? So loving like a Pharisee, loving like a tax collector, third, loving like a pagan. Again, not filling this up. Pagan meaning Gentile, the distant people, the foreigners. And if you live back in the day where Jesus is preaching, you know that a Jew and a pagan, a Jew and a Gentile do not mix. In the temple, there was a physical wall that would have divided these two groups of people. So, you're a Gentile, and you're walking to the school gate. Who are the people you greet? Other Gentiles. You're walking down the street. Who are the people you shake hands with? Other Gentiles. Which pub do you drink in? The pagan pub. There's a line, a difference, because you greet only your own people. Here's the mindset. We gather according to our kind. We stick with our own. We're loyal to our clan. We're suspicious of difference. We're snobbish about others. You greet only your own. Now, see how Jesus is lining up these three things? Love your neighbor, hate your enemy. Love those who love you. Greet only your own people. What's he saying? These three groups might look as different can be, but when it comes down to baseline how you operate, we are all exactly the same. And we default to what is easy, we default to what is natural, we default to what is comfortable. And here's why. Why is it that we love people who love us? We love people who love us because essentially it is a way of loving ourselves. When you love those who love you and you greet those who are your own people, you are essentially, I am essentially, loving myself. I surround myself with people like me, who think how I think, who like what I like, who accept what I like and who I am, who don't challenge what I do, who don't take me out of my comfort zone, who don't reveal any of my blind spots, and allow me to be who I want me to be. You see the point? When I love those who love me, I'm actually loving myself. Which actually is the very thing that fuels all the isms. Classism, racism, isn't it? Even in a little church like ours, we see it. It's who we are. It's what's natural. Why is it that those of us from the scheme find it easier to hang out with and spend time with other people from a scheme? Why is it that those of us who are middle class find it way easier to chat to other middle class people after church? Why do we find it hard to mix? It's because we love those who love us. We love those who are like us. You see it in churches as well when people come from other countries to Edinburgh. What tends to happen is we create churches around types. Yeah, you have a young people's church. You have a middle class church. You have a scheme church. You have a Filipino church. You have a Chinese church. Why? It's easy. We naturally easily love those who love us and greet those who we consider our own. You see, all these three are the same. You with me? Let me show you one that's different. Read again the second half of verse 45. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and he sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Here is love like the Heavenly Father, who loves his enemies. Now you may be used to thinking about your own little life in this big old creation with no reference to God. He's an afterthought, he's an irrelevance, maybe you even think he's a non-reality. But when Jesus thinks about our little lives in this massive universe, he cannot help but name-check the Creator God. He says, every morning when the sun creeps above the horizon, God is the cause. He says every day when the rain falls, God is the one who sends the rain, the causer of the rising sun, the sender of the falling rain. He is the controlling creator God. You need to see what he's saying here. From the vastness of the burning, blazing sun to the minuteness of a tiny droplet of rain, every single thing comes from God's hand. And interestingly, they are the two very things we need to live, aren't they? Light and water. Apart from God, we have no life. And yet Jesus doesn't just want you here to see him as this controlling creator God. He's making the point because he wants to show he is a loving heavenly Father. Sun and rain are not just weather, they're love, he says. But again, getting to his point, love for who? He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. The point about this loving heavenly Father is that he is the who? The enemy-loving heavenly Father. The same sun that shines on the charitable organization is also the sun that is shining on the terrorist cell. The same rain that gives life to a life-saving surgeon gives life to a life-taking paedophile. The same sun that rises and rain that falls on the abused is the sun that rises and the rain that falls on the abuser. He is the enemy-loving heavenly Father, Jew and Gentile, Pharisee and tax collector, you and me. Pours out his love. Now listen, you need to hear this. Because he loves his enemies, because he loves a terrorist or a paedophile or an abuser, does not mean that he is indifferent or will ignore the actions of the terrorist, the paedophile, or the abuser. His love is not a love of indifference. You need to see that he still labels them here evil. He still calls them unrighteous. And actually the fact that he is the all-controlling creator God is my confidence and my comfort that one day he will call every evil, unrighteous person and act to account. He will one day judge all who are evil and unrighteous. And the unrighteous and the evil who have experienced something of his love here on earth will experience nothing but his wrath in hell. Interesting, Jesus in Matthew 24 is going to use the language of Isaiah the prophet in Isaiah 13. Now listen to this, what he says. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day, with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and to destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I'll punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I'll put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and humble the pride of the ruthless. Although he loves his enemies now, there will come a time when his enemies will suffer eternal darkness. But what he is saying is that today there is something distinctive, something unique about the love of God. He doesn't just love his neighbours. He doesn't just love those who love him. He doesn't just greet his own. But every time you open the curtains and you see that the sun has risen, and every time that you hear the rain fall, it is a reminder of God's enemy love. Indiscriminating, good and evil. However, if you're sat here this morning as a Christian, you know that the love of God for his enemies isn't confined to the rising of a sun, but it's extended to the sending of his Son. Let me read you some words from the Apostle Paul. Once here. Paul writes, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Since we've now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? For if while we were what? God's enemies. If while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his Son, how much more, having been reconciled, shall we be saved through his life? It is one thing that God, for the sake of his enemies, would cause rain to fall. It is another ballpark entirely for God, for his enemies, to send his Son to die. Here's a question. Who would you die for? If you were to count up on your hands how many people in this entire world you would die for, how many people would it be? I reckon my close family, and probably not many more. But if you were to ask me to think of the person that has harmed me the most, hated me the most, hurt me the most, and ask me the question, would you die for them? I would not need a second's thought to answer, no. Not a chance. And yet Paul says it was when I was ungodly, when I was unrighteous, when I was far from good, when I was full of sin, when I was God's enemy, God loved me. Jesus saved me from God's wrath. Jesus justified me. Jesus reconciled me. Jesus changed me from God's enemy bound for hell to his friend bound for heaven. It's an amazing thing. Jesus was the forever Son of God. He was the perfect Son of Man. And yet when he came to earth, humanity made him public enemy number one. They loved the Pharisees. They hated Jesus. And they strung him up on a tree like an enemy. But as you see Jesus hanging on a cross, executed by an enemy humanity, the cross is not just a symbol of humanity's hatred for Jesus. The cross is a symbol of God's love for an enemy humanity. And as he died on the cross, what happened to the sun? The sun that since Eden had shone its love on an evil enemy humanity did what? Stop shining. On who? The perfect Son of God. As darkness fell around Jesus, the judgment of God fell on Jesus. And if you were stood at the cross, plunged into darkness, do you know what you would have heard? You couldn't have seen anything. You would have heard one voice. Do you know what he was saying? Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Then in the darkness of the cross, he prays for the soldiers who are crucifying him. And he dies for the centurion that was standing guard over his murder. And he was dying even for a guy like Saul, who would be a murderer of his followers. In the darkness of the cross, he's dying for his enemies, Pharisee and tax collector, Jew and Gentile, you and me. As the cross shows the Heavenly Father demonstrating his love for his enemies, and the cross demonstrating and proving and achieving Jesus dying for his enemies. See, come back to the start of the sermon, right? We read this, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And the first question that comes to my mind is, how could I love my enemies? Do you know what the first question that should come to mind is? How could God love me? See, when God loved you, it was not a love for those who loved him. And if God is to greet you one day into heaven, it is not him greeting those who are his own. It is a unique, it is an enemy love. And we need to go through these kind of 3 steps to get to this one before you can get to the number 5, because you will never begin to even imagine loving an enemy until you've realized your enemy status before the God of heaven. Until you've comprehended the absolutely audacious, extraordinary love of God for you, an enemy, you would never begin to think about loving someone who's your enemy. But that's where Jesus goes. 5th, loving like the Heavenly Father's children, you love your enemies. Here's the foundation for his command, that if you're a Christian, your fundamental identity has changed. You are no longer in the category Pharisee. You're no longer in the category tax collector. You're no longer in the category of pagan. You're no longer in the category of enemy. You're in this new category of what? Child of God. A son or daughter of the Heavenly Father. Your life has been eternally changed and filled by his enemy love. He says, something more about you now. Notice what he said? What are you doing more than others? When you're a child of the Heavenly Father, there's more about you. There's more in you. That's why he says this mental thing in verse 48. Look down. Be perfect as your Heavenly Father is perfect. That's not here as some impossibly high standard that's meant to crush you. That is actually an invitation into a reality because of who you now are as a child of your Heavenly Father. You're no longer limited in your love to just loving your neighbours or loving those who love you or greeting your own people. Perfect love about you because you have been perfectly loved when you were an enemy. In a phrase, you begin to love as you have been loved. I had a really sore back this week, right? And yesterday, Sarah was out for most of the day, and at one point, Ruben wanted me to be a horse, right, down on all fours, so I could like clippity-clop around the room with him on my back. And I said to him, mate, my back's too sore to do that. Do you know what he did? Came up to me, goes, oh, Ruben, rub it better. He goes, better now? Now, where's he got that from? Say to me. What's he doing? He's just loving as he has been loved. How is it Jesus can command enemy love from his followers? For the simple reason, because he expects us to begin to love as we have been loved. Here's the sermon in a tweet. A Christian's behaviour isn't determined by how you've been treated by your enemies, but how you have been treated by Jesus. Every time I'm confronted with someone who's my enemy, do you know what I'm seeing? I'm seeing a mirror. A mirror that shows how I treated God. And every time I'm confronted by an enemy, I'm seeing a picture of the gospel of how God has treated me. You were loved when you were an enemy, so you begin to love your enemies. And you can say, this is impossible. I would say, it happens in the Bible. A boy called Stephen gets saved by the enemy love of Jesus, called to be a follower of him. He preaches a sermon. People hate it so much, they charge towards him with stones to take his life. Do you know what he prays? Lord, don't hold this sin against him. Who did he nick that from? The darkness of the cross when he heard Jesus pray, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Stephen loves as he has been loved. The guy who's presiding over his death is a man called Saul. He was a murderer of loads, including Stephen. One day, a short time later, Jesus comes to Saul, saves him, enemy love. Do you know what we're told the church did? They took Saul in, they fed him, strengthened him, and called him brother. Enemy love. Now, how on earth are we going to begin doing this? When we started a sermon saying, it is impossible. Let me give you 4 very quick things if you want to try and start loving your enemies. Number 1, pray for them. Even if you can just mutter out a prayer that is something like, Father, forgive them, we don't know what they're doing. Second, be gentle towards them. Listen to this proverb. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. If in the midst of an enemy swearing at you, threatening you, the best thing you can try and do to mimic Jesus and show love is gentleness. Third thing, pray for them, be gentle towards them, be generous towards them. Let me give you another proverb. If your enemy's hungry, give him food to eat. If he's thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you'll heap burning coals on his head. The Lord will reward you. Generous. And it will be even harder for them to take than a punch across their mush. They won't know what to do with it. Last, don't gloat over them when they stumble. Another proverb. Don't gloat when your enemy falls, when they stumble. Don't let your heart rejoice, or the Lord will see and disapprove and turn his wrath away from them. Don't gloat over your enemy. You never know. Saul might one day be Paul. Your enemy might be a future brother. God's patience in showing them sun and rain love might be to lead them to see the Son, Jesus' love. Pray for them, be gentle towards them, be generous towards them, don't gloat over them. And remember, last thing, I'll say it again. A Christian's behavior is not determined by how you have been treated by your enemies, but how Jesus treated you when you were his enemy.